Hi everyone, welcome back to the Vedic Cosmos. We've been talking about the 20 items of knowledge. We've talked about several in the last couple of videos. Here I'm continuing on the same theme, starting with steadiness. Steadiness in Sanskrit is referred to as dhairyam. It defines one's ability to be steady or to be determined. Being steady and determined is a very important quality in spiritual life. The reason for that is without being steady or determined, one cannot make much progress in spiritual life. The material energy is so strong that we get carried away with it typically in our normal course of life, but to overcome its influence, one has to be determined and make progress in spiritual life. Next is self-control. It actually goes hand in hand with steadiness or determination. Self-control is known as Atma Vinigraha in Sanskrit. It signifies not being carried away, to retain ability to distinguish favorable versus unfavorable. We encounter so many situations in life, but not all of them are favorable for us to advance in spiritual life. In such cases, one should be able to detach oneself from that situation, not get carried away, not fall down, but always keep rising up in spiritual life. So, in summary, one should not accept anything which is detrimental to the path of spiritual progress. As one practices spiritual life steadily with determination, one gets the intelligence to determine what is correct, what is not correct, what is favorable, and what is detrimental to one's spiritual progress. So, one should be able to follow that cue, follow that intelligence, and practice self-control of not indulging, not being carried away in all kinds of situations. The next important quality we'll consider is renunciation of sense gratification. So we have senses, we have 5 knowledge acquiring senses, 5 working senses, and the mind is called as the sense within. It's the controller of all our senses through which we do work and we also acquire knowledge from the world. The senses always need some engagement. That engagement is called as gratification. The senses need something, some engagement, something to do. So allowing them to go into that engagement is called gratification. But the renunciation of the objects of sense gratification, called as Indriya Artheshu Vairagyam. Vairagyam refers to as renunciation or being detached from this principle of always gratifying one's senses. So one should be able to control one's senses, not get carried away with the senses, and particularly renouncing the objects of sense gratification is a very important aspect of knowledge to progress in spiritual life. Because if one is always engaged in sense gratification, the mind is always engaged in thinking about that. The mind is never free to think about higher aspects of reality, to not is not present to practice spiritual life and to focus on our soul and the ultimate benefit that we can derive from spiritual knowledge. So renunciation means not to indulge in unnecessary sense gratification. Some sense gratification, some engagement is necessary. It is required because that's the very nature of the senses. Even to keep our body and mind fit together to practice spiritual life, one has to engage in some limited minimal sense gratification. So one should definitely take care of one's body well, but not take it as a liberty to indulge in excessively gratifying the senses. This particularly refers to intoxication. These days, intoxication in terms of smoking or drinking alcohol and other forms of sense gratification is very popular and is advertised and also glorified in some situations. but it is not to be followed, it is not to be taken to heart, and one should not indulge in such behaviors involving intoxication. It is very detrimental to one's spiritual life. The next aspect of knowledge I'm going to talk about is absence of false ego. Absence of false ego is called anahankara. We first need to understand what is false ego. False ego is this idea of accepting the body as oneself. Ego means identity and false means false. It is not true, it doesn't last. So false ego means untrue identity or false identity. And false ego is one of the material energies that is created in this world to enamor the living entities to identify themselves with material energy. But one who are serious about spiritual life, they try to rise above this material energy. They try to come out of the influence of false ego, and that goes hand in hand. It's synonymous to trying to find out one's real identity. One's real identity or ego is that we are spirit souls. We are part and parcel of the supreme absolute truth. And the body is just like a covering of material energy on the soul. As long as we are under this covering, under the influence of this covering, our real identity remains hidden. The whole idea of spiritual life is to uncover our real identity and let go and disassociate, to disengage with our false identity or false ego. The last item of knowledge that I'll cover in this video is about the understanding of reality about birth, death, old age, and disease. In the normal course of life, enjoyment in this world is glorified, is something looked forward to, is something that everyone endeavors for. But the common sufferings that all human beings across the planet experience are these four: the sufferings related to birth, death, old age, and disease. None of these are favorable, or none of these are enjoyable. Old age, disease, and death, that is understandable, that is obvious, the suffering associated with those. But even the suffering associated with birth is also very significant. The living entity is packed up for many months in a very tight spot within the womb of the mother before one is born. In this case, I'm talking about human beings, but in all other cases as well, all other species as well, the whole process of birth is a very painful process. But because we forget that pain that we've undergone, we don't consider it as particularly as a suffering. But besides birth, no one wants to die, so death is an unfavorable situation that all of us have to encounter at some point. Similarly, getting disease or old age is also very much disliked, but nobody is able to control this influence of time and the force of material energy which inflicts this suffering on us. So being honest and being accepting that these four aspects of life are actually evils or unfavorable situations, their sufferings forced upon us, to perceive this, to accept this, is actually a symptom of knowledge. Unless one understands these realities of life as suffering, one doesn't really get a clear impetus to take to spiritual life and make rapid progress in it. So the perception of evil of birth, death, old age, and disease is known as Janma, Mrityu, Jara, Vyadhi, Dukkha, Doshanu, Darshanam. Dukkha means associates with suffering, and Doshanu, Darshanam means clear perception of these aspects as dukkha, as suffering. These are the real problems of human life. If one wants to make progress in human life, it's not by inventing fancy technology to make our lives comfortable, but it's really to address these four problems for which there is no solution within the realm of material science, technology, and material knowledge. So unless one develops a pessimistic view of material life to consider the distresses of birth, death, old age, and disease, these are real. These are real sufferings, and these are real problems in human society. And as a whole, we don't have any solution in the material aspect. So unless one accepts that, then one is not ready to take to spiritual principles, to understand our spiritual identity, and to acquire spiritual knowledge. So it is very important to understand these distresses, to accept it as they are. Then one finds impetus, one finds encouragement, and one finds motivation to make advancement in spiritual life. The solutions to these problems are all spiritual in nature. If we accept the spiritual reality, spiritual truth, and try to discover it for ourselves, then we can surpass these problems of birth, death, old age, and disease. Thank you. I'll again see you in the next video. Bye.